Officially welcome you all along. That's fantastic to see such a great crowd on such a interesting topic. I mean, the budget came out last night. It's been an interesting few years in Australia. I mean, we've had, the global financial crisis. Australia went from being very profitable to very deficit-driven. We've had an incredibly weird political time over the last few years, having got rid of many of our own prime ministers, not through the vote, but through their own mechanisms. No one's really even got any charge. They don't have control of the Senate. It's just a chaotic time. And things are bad in Australia when Darren Hinch is in control of the Senate and his one vote now is casting everything aside. And that's a former radio jock, for those of you in Singapore that don't know. He's just unbelievable that his career has led him into Parliament. But, anything can happen in Australia, apparently just like America. But today we're going to go through last night's budget, 13th time we've done this. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. Now, unfortunately, as we have to do in the modern age, I'll need to start with a disclaimer. And just the information here is basically everything that's available to you generally. It's my opinion. And I wouldn't take anything of this as advice. If you've got your own personal circumstances, they need to be assessed first. But, by all means, I intend to give you a very informative, session. But you should obviously consider your own circumstances. So don't sue me later, please. That would be wonderful. But, we'll get started. And as always, I like to start with the agenda. And normally I have to figure this out. Every budget for the last 13 years, it's been a mystery. And you have to try and unlock the code. But this year, for the first time, the agenda was clearly set out by Scott Morrison, because he's got a 5-point plan. Tax relief is what this budget is all about. It's the main element of this budget. Not because he's trying to buy voters apparently, but because Australians deserve a reward for many years of hard luck, many years of low growth on wages, many years of tolerating the people in Canberra for that matter. So tax relief took front and centre here. They're also backing businesses, because businesses are driving the economy. That's really where most of the underlying growth's coming. A lot of the employment is driving from there. Governments are trying to shrink down in theory, but every time they sack, they seem to re-employ. But small business is seen very much as the future in Australia, and they're backing business strongly. They want to make sure every Australian feels safe and secure that they will get the services they need in old age, in health, in school. So there's a strong commitment and a significant spending program that's been going on for quite a few years to ensure Australians feel comfortable. This budget, you'll note, doesn't have a lot of announcements when it comes to essential services, and that's largely because there's been big announcements previously, but we'll talk about that later. But Australians are being assured that everything they need and want will be provided. And they also need to feel safe. The border control is important, terrorism issues are important, so that's the key element they're looking for. But probably the main thing that the government is trying to show everyone is that it's essential that Australia, on a political and governmental level, lives within its means. And that is what we have not been doing for a decade. For a decade, we've been borrowing money to survive, not to invest, to survive. And you'll see that as we go. But these are the 5 key pillars of this government. And that is the agenda of this budget. And this was the key focus of everything that has come out from it. Now, I always have a favourite quote, and this one is stick to the plan. I think this is an incredible budget. I think people are saying, it's an election budget. It's not an election budget. It is a multi-election budget. This is the first time ever that a government has said, don't vote me in next election, vote me in for the next 3 elections, please. That's what they're doing in this budget. And that's unheralded in Australia. I think in Singapore, that's how Lee Kuan Yew did it. He said, I'll be here for 50 years, like it or not. So they let him have a go, and it worked pretty well. You miss him, don't you? But, they want to be stuck to the plan. They want to make sure they get the support. So let's have a look at the numbers. Very interestingly, what stands out straight away here is that for the first time ever in the last decade, the government has been able to achieve its forecast. It's phenomenal to see that the government has been able to achieve not just near the forecast, but massively better. In 2017-18, they forecast to have a $29 billion deficit, and they actually came in at $18 billion. $10 billion improvement. Now, the one thing that disappoints me greatly is that no one has said a word about that in Australia. No one has said, well done, good job, top effort. Not a single person. This is, the second time they've achieved it, but we didn't know they achieved it last time because the estimates weren't quite finished off. Every year it takes them about 18 months to get the accounts right, and they've had to review the estimates from 2016-17, where last year when we presented, the budget missed the mark only marginally. But with the reviewed estimates, they actually came in last year under budget forecast as well. So we've had 2 years in a row now of under budget forecast. And that is a massive turning point in Australia. And again, something that no one is giving anyone credit for. What they are saying is, oh, he's lucky, he had a windfall, the global economy improved. Oh, it's all just luck. Well, I don't think so. You can't get lucky that big that often. And he's done it now 2 years in a row. But more importantly, if you look back at the previous years, he was very, very close in most years. In his first budget, it was 33 estimate, 38 billion deficit, 35, 39. So he was within cooee when you consider that the last Labor budget, they were only $30 billion out. Just 30 billion, almost there. So I don't think this is luck anymore. Now, I gave them credit last year for being very, very close. And I'm going to give him real credit this year for being well ahead of the target. Now, you might say that it's lucky because the main driver is indeed increased revenue. They had forecast revenue to be 433 billion. It came in at 445. Again, if you've been to last year's budget and certainly the last budgets of the last 4 or 5 years, I've been very, very sceptical at forward forecasts, saying, look, they were unrealistic, it didn't seem logical. But last year was the first time I said, you know what? He has a chance with this budget. Not only did he have a chance, he blew it away. He got 10 billion extra. But the most important part of that to me is that unlike other governments of past, when he had that extra $10 billion revenue, he didn't spend it. You can see expenditure stayed right on track. 459.7 came in at 459.9. Now, it must have been really tempting. They actually know what's in the bank. They don't tell us, but they know what's coming in. It must have been really tempting to have an extra $10 billion and go, ooh, let's go shopping. No, leave it there. And that's what they did. So that restraint, is a very good character trait. Now you might say, oh, it's lucky, the global economy, but it's not that. What the government pinned their hopes on last year and the year before was on jobs and growth. That was their platform. They said, we need to grow the economy. We need more taxpayers. We need less people out of work. And that will drive revenue. And that's exactly what happened. Over 400,000 new jobs created last year. And what that means is less people on unemployment, more people paying tax. And in Australia, I don't know if you know, but you pay a fair bit of tax. 50, 60, 70 grand is $5,000, $6,000, $8,000. And if you were on unemployment benefits, you're pulling $20,000, $25,000, $30,000. So if you turn that around from an outlay of 20,000 plus to a revenue of 5 or 10 or 15, that's a massive turnaround in government coffers. The employment impact of 400,000 people is something in the order of $3 or $4 billion alone. So 30, 40% of that revenue gain is pure income tax. That's phenomenal. And hence why they've been able to achieve it. Now you can see unemployment was predicted at 5.75 and it came in at 5.25. That 0.5% improvement is significant government revenue. And that's why this government was so committed to say, let's invest in infrastructure, let's go and do growth projects, let's do all this. It will generate revenue, and it has. The other government was all about, let's tax more and we'll get more money in. And of course that contracts the economy. You're getting a percentage of revenue. If the revenue contracts, guess what? So too does your revenue. So this is a difference in philosophy, but it's certainly bearing great result here right now. Next year, they're forecasting a $14.5 billion deficit. The year after, it moves to a $2 billion surplus, what they're calling imbalance. They don't want to call it a surplus. because they're afraid that if the wind changes or if something happens or they don't achieve it, everyone will say, you promised a surplus. No, he's just saying we're going to be in balance. But only the year after next, we are very close to getting the figures done. And you could be optimistic, you could be pessimistic, you could do whatever you want, but the hardcore reality is it's there. Now next year they're forecasting 6.4% increase in revenue. Again, largely on the back of an expanding economy. Now, I think that's potentially doable. So it'll be very interesting to see how they go in that regard. But I'm going to give them a potentially doable mark because they've shown credibility. One of the reasons that they've also done that is their forecasting is relatively conservative on things like commodity prices. Again, the Labor government, one of the reasons their budget forecast was so out is they were always way optimistic on their expectations and then sadly disappointed. But these guys usually are conservative and then rewarded, and that makes a lot more sense. Now you can see growth in payments is going to be 5.4%. That's quite a bit. There's a lot of programs going on, including NDIS, etc. You know, GDP is expected to kick up to 3%, and that's largely on the back of record population growth in Australia. We're really pulling in huge numbers there, 400,000 plus. But unemployment is bet to stay the same. So they're not forecasting it to improve. They're going to stay the same. And then CPI, which I still think is unbelievable that it's that low. I still can't work that one out. That's meant to sit there still at that 2% range, which is what the RBA likes. But all these numbers are very achievable. And again, I cannot stress enough how good an effort it's been for them to come in under expectations and how disappointing it is that nobody in Australia can even take 1 second to acknowledge that. To just dismiss it as luck when you're talking about these sorts of numbers is, I think, disgraceful, especially when they get copped so much. In terms of living within the means, here's a very good graph that demonstrates that. The dark blue is what's called, their recurrent activities. And that's basically your income and expenses. They're non-investment related activities, pensions, welfares, administration. And really, you should be able to fund your day-to-day operating from your revenue. But as you can see, over the last decade, we've been running our operating account at a deficit. We haven't even been able to afford our day-to-days. So then when we do invest, which is the light blue, it pushes that deficit and debt out to huge numbers. But what they have been able to do is turn that around, and now this year, they've not only paid for their operating expenses, they've got a little bit left over. Now they're still investing, but you can see the expectation there is that that profit, if you want to call it, from the government operations is now going to start to escalate if they keep things in order, if they keep to a plan and work it and see how it goes. And that's important. We need to be able to pay for day to day. It's no good having a huge schools program if we're not able to afford it from general revenue. There's no point having a big health budget if we can't afford it from day-to-day revenue, because that's not investment, that's just operating. So it's great to see this back in the right direction. And tax is the cornerstone of this budget. And you can see it's a huge change that they're looking to bring in a long time. Now, normally, tax would be talked about over the next year, 2 years. And yes, they are bringing in immediate cuts. We're seeing the 32.5% band, the upper threshold of that lifted from 87 to 90,000. And the main thing that they brought in is this middle income offset of $530 if your income is under 125,000, where it tapers off to zero. That's worth, for an average working couple, $1,000 a year plus a little bit, a couple $100 on the tax. That's $1,500 roughly. That's good value. That's essential money if you're on that $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 salary each. It's not huge, but it's important. But you can see what they've done, interestingly, is the next tax cut. They've already said, we're going to give it to you, but not until 2022, which is quite amazing. That's quite a way away. That's 4 years. But they're saying, we're taking you there because we can and we can afford it. So at least you know what you're going to get. And then in 2024, they're changing the tax rate again, by abolishing the 37% tax rate and bringing 32.5 all the way from 41,000 all the way up to 200,000. They are suggesting that almost 90% of all Australians will never pay more than 32.5% in their lifetime, which is quite attractive. 37, when you earn over $87,000, $90,000, is still a lot of tax to pay at a fairly modest income by modern standards. But it's fair and reasonable. And the government is saying, hey, we have to be fair. These people are carrying the burden. Something like, the top tax rate of 49, 4% of the people are in that rate carrying 30% of the tax burden for income tax. In the 37% bracket, there's 35% of the 35% of the revenue from 19% of the people. So the top two brackets are only 23% of the population carrying 65% of the cost. And what's happening in Australia, there's this two-way split. There's people saying, oh, we should give more to everybody, and there's people saying, I can't give any more from me. And that's why the government's had to go in a deficit for so long. But they're trying to fix it because this will mean that very few people will be ever again in the higher rates of the 37 plus. So again, very, very good that they're going there. Unusual that it's so far down the line. So far down the line, you do need binoculars, in fact. But here is the way they're looking at bracket creep. And they're saying it is their money. One of the things that Scott Morrison has been very clear to say, everyone's saying, oh, why are you giving cuts? Why are you doing this? Why? We should keep the money. And he's reminding people, look, it's not my money, it's their money. It's the taxpayers' money. Why should we take it? And right now, today in Parliament, there was a big stoush going between Liberal and Labor. Labor is saying, hey, show us how you can afford this. And Liberal are basically saying, no, we don't need to. You should live within your means. This is what we consider to be fair. You should show that you can afford to run government at this level. But you can see what they're trying to do is avoid what they call bracket creep. Where at the current level, 53% are in the middle bracket and 20% in the third tier. In the very near future, that's going to sneak to 47 and 29. But under the Liberals' proposal by 24-25, 73% of Australian taxpayers will be at the 32.5% tax rate and likely stay there for most of their life. And that's a revelation. If you ask any Australian in the room if they would be happy to just pay 32.5% tax, I'm pretty sure they'll take that. And again, what happens is we're the most obedient taxpayers in the world, but we now get encouragement to go work a little bit extra. So maybe the economy turbocharges as well, because I don't mind doing overtime if I get to keep 60-odd% of it. The problem for a lot of Australians now is I only get to keep 50% of my overtime. 40% if I'm lucky on my tax, 60% if I'm in the lower rate. But it's not worth my while. But if I get to keep 60%, that's pretty good, or 70%, that's pretty good. In terms of the budget, it's still an infrastructure blitz. This government has been on a 10-year program, $75 billion, and they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, that's all that's been going on. It's just constantly ongoing. Now, I usually would put up what's new, but there's so much regurgitation at the moment. They always have the same project almost every year. There's only a few brand new projects, but you can see they've committed to a lot of things. Now, this is important investment all over Australia. Roads, rail, all go, go, go. And again, this is economic stimulus as well as economic efficiency. So it's been a good idea for them to do that, and certainly been a benefactor in the economic growth. The other things that are going on in this budget, we've got a high-tech upgrade. There's a $1.9 billion going into collaborative infrastructure strategy, making Australia better, including some new supercomputers, $29 million going into an AI ethics framework, and God help us as AI starts to kick in. It's already there. How many of you have got that little box of Google in your home that you just ask everything? I'm afraid. I don't want that. But if you have it, good luck. And then we're also going to enhance the GPS so we can track our kids because they're getting out of hand. So, we're going to make it a lot more efficient. It's a big country, so it takes a lot of GPS encouragement. And being old and healthy in Australia is important because we're living too long now. We're going older and older. And the government's happy about that because they're going to make us work longer and longer. They're pushing the retirement age to 70 now instead of 65. But, you know, they've got to also say, well, hold on, we don't want you in homes either. They're really keen to get everybody to stay at home rather than go into private care. And they're going to spend $1.6 billion to help 14,000 people stay at home. Now, I just did a quick maths. That's 114,000 per person per year. That's crazy. So it's an incredible achievement that we're going to spend that much. It's fantastic. But you can see this is the culture of Australia. Let everybody have the best at any cost at the taxpayer. Throw them onto him. And that's great. But, you know, I'm very worried. That's why I put this little graphic there, because I'm worried we're going to have weekend at Bernie's. Because if you're making $100,000 to keep someone at home, I want someone to go check they're still alive. I'm not sure they'll report it. It's a massive industry, and I had the own experience of, one of my good colleagues. The benefits that are available are phenomenal. They come and see you, make sure you're chirpy, do your groceries, do your gardening. It's just phenomenal. I can't wait to get old. Oops, I already am. Heck, I'll qualify next year. But it's a great place, Australia, and they want to lift that to 74,000 places. They want people to stay at home. And it could be an interesting trend in the future where people will be opening their home to the young to come and stay with them. You won't be sharing a flat with your university friends. You'll be sharing a flat with your university friends' grandparents. That's what's going to happen in the future. Mark my words. It's coming. And there's 83 million for mental health services, because it does get lonely when you're all there by yourself. And hence why getting people to share with them is a good option. They also are spending a lot of money on community programs to get them active and physically engaged in the community, enhancing sporting clubs, etc. There's lots of money going for that. And then medically, there's $1.4 billion additional dollars over the next 3 or 4 years for new drugs. They're really expanding what drugs you can take now, bringing on some nice stuff for cancer and all these sorts of things. And they're also going crazy into research. So genomic health tests, where you can go and check before, while it's still fetal, if there's any issues. The whole world is changing too fast for my like. And clinical trials, everything going on. And the regional doctors, they're in a real big push to get people out there. At the same time, they're stopping foreign doctors coming in, which is a bit strange because they're usually the ones that go into the bush. But they're trying to open up 4,000 spots of both doctors and nurses and get them out into the bush as quickly as they can. The federal police, they're also going to get looked after pretty well because they're doing a pretty good job keeping the boats at bay, but there's still a few coming. But these days we don't let them in. We turn them around, go off there, you can't make it. It's how it is. Very controversial still, but very necessary. Very necessary. We still have the refugee programs, we just can't let anyone come. We're improving our border security. Excuse me. With $120 million of improved security screening and checking at the international airports, a new cargo screening system around Australia, $50 million for security upgrades at regional airports too. So all on, everyone's getting a bit of a checkup. And then $158 million to fight transnational crime, major crime, cyber, all these sorts of things. So that's a huge boost. And $130 million to improve our intelligence network. So a lot of overseas work with embassies, etc. Try and get information before it arrives. So lots of money going in to make that safer. If you're in superannuation retirement, there's now for everybody that's, it's amazing how many Australians don't know where their superannuation is. They had different employers and they got a little bit over here and a little bit over there. It was always a nuisance to go and track it down. The tax office is going to do that automatically for you now. So they're going to go and just get your tax file number, grab it and track it all down. They're also helping people with small funds by limiting fees to no more than 3%. And they're also banning any exit fees if you want to swap your fund out. They cannot charge you anymore to take your funds out. And for people under 25, they've been complaining apparently that they get charged for life insurance in their super fund, and that's obviously eroding the value. They now have to opt in, where before it was pretty much automatic that you got life insurance. You now have to opt in if you're under 25 that you want insurance, because apparently when you're 25, you just don't need it. And then for pensioners, they're also going to allow you to earn a little bit more without it affecting your pension. So, again, at 65, 70, 75, you can keep working. And in fact, the government's now encouraging you to start up your business at 75, apparently. So it's never too late, as they say. You know, you can get going whenever it is. I'm glad I didn't start this at 75 because I've been going 20 odd years and I'm exhausted. But, you know, we'll see how it goes. But other tax changes, and there was quite a lot. You know, they brought in what they call their speed limit on tax, so 23.9% GDP. That's the government's commitment to not have any more tax revenue than that. They think if it gets more than that, they're actually going to contract the economy. So they're saying, this is our mission, this is where we are. That's one of the reasons that they're handing back these tax cuts so far in advance, because they're saying, we're committed to this long term. And again, they're using it obviously as a political leverage to try and put Labor on the table to say, well, how much are you going to grab? Because that's about the only thing they've got on Labor. So they're working on it. There was last year meant to be a 0.5% increase in Medicare, solely to fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Things have gone so well, the government said, hey, we don't need to do that anymore. And that's about $3 billion a year that they're raising in alternate sources that they don't now have to charge, that 0.5%. So that's what 0.5% is worth to the tax system, about $3 odd billion. Now, it's also now becoming illegal to buy anything and pay $10,000 or more in cash. They're going after the black economy, they're giving the tax office some extra powers and extra cash to do it, and it's now illegal for any business in Australia to accept more than $10,000 cash payment. Now, that's not just to catch the person paying, but it's also to catch the guy doing the job. It'll be illegal for you to get someone to do work at your house and pay them cash. It'll be illegal for him to receive your cash. You'll all be sharing the same cell, you know. It's no good. But at least someone will be able to make it look pretty, you know, the painter or whatever. But, you know, they're really onto this, and all governments are like this. That's why they love us to have credit cards and online banking and all this sort of stuff, because it's all visible, and that's what they love. You know, the $20,000 write-off for assets bought as a small business, continuing for another year. And this is likely to be a long-term continuation, although it is a year-by-year challenge. And they're going after the digital economy. They've been able to bring in over $7 billion of revenue into the system. Now, part of this is GST-driven, part of it is profit-driven, but it's a huge amount of additional capture. The research and development grants that the government's doing have been phenomenal. We benefited that because we have a technology company of our own, and it's a huge support for a lot of people, particularly developers and stuff in Australia. They're making it a little bit easier for the small and a little bit harder for the big to get. And the multinationals are still well and truly in their sights. Now, they're fighting these ones. It's a big, hard battle to get, but they're certainly after them, and that's not going to change. They're going to make sure that everybody pays their fair share, and they're not alone. Every government around the world is pretty determined to get their crack of the whip there. We're also seeing the company tax. They've reaffirmed their commitment to that. They can't quite get it through the Senate yet. You've got a few holding out. Some are saying we should exclude the banks. It's a bit ridiculous. But, they've been naughty. They've got a Royal Commission going. But, all the stuff in the Royal Commission was already pre-known. There's no new stuff coming out. It's just really, really dirty laundry airing. But it's unlikely you'd exclude a group, but they'll try that, and it's politically motivated anyways. But, we've certainly got the lower, smaller companies tax cuts in. We're now at 27.5% at the moment, and we're moving towards that. And one of the things I did like is they're now going to say you can't get a government contract if you're a naughty person for your tax. So if you're not lodging your tax returns, not paying your debts, you won't be able to get government contracts. And they're giving the ATO more money to get, bad taxpayers and also bad accountants. So, luckily we've never let anyone do bad, dodgy things, but, if you have an accountant that is helping you do bad tax planning, hiding money, etc., he will go to jail with you as well. So you'll have your painter and your accountant and yourself all in the same cell, It's all nice and cosy, And of course, one of the other changes is that previously we've been allowed to claim expenses on vacant land if it was getting the property ready for rental. But some people have been dragging that on for way too long, so they've removed that, and now they say that's capital cost until it is actually income producing. Other announcements, there's quite a bit. They're going after tobacco. Apparently there's a whole industry making cigarettes somewhere in the back somewhere that I didn't know about, but that's only because I don't smoke anymore. But they're going to raise $3 billion over the next 4 years, chasing importers that are smuggling it in, chasing manufacturers that aren't registered. It's a lot of money because apparently it's 70 cents a stick now, the tax. 70 cents a cigarette. Wow. Lise. Cashless debit cards for welfare. It's something that's been long talked about, constantly pushed back and resisted, finally coming into play. I think it's a good thing. And again, it's part of our modern society. Everything will come to you on a card very soon. If you like craft beer, if it's in the smaller kegs, that's going to be a bit cheaper. There's $440 million for preschool and kindy, extending the funding for another year. Again, if you've been following the news in Australia, the whole preschool, kindergarten industry is up in arms saying they don't get paid enough, they're demanding more pay. And again, it's so typical of Australia. They go on the news and they say, we know the parents can't afford to pay any more, so the government should pay it all. The government's already paying unbelievable amounts of money for this, and it's still never enough. And that's the problem in Australia, it's never enough. There's $250 million to extend the chaplain program, and there's a big emphasis on bullying in schools, which is a big, big problem in Australia and globally. We've got to toughen our kids up a bit. $500 million going for the Great Barrier Reef, hopefully not too long, not too late. But of course, you've got to remember that if the Great Barrier Reef's gone, you can come over to Ningaloo Reef over in West Australia. It's nicer anyways and bigger and a lot less people, so it's even good. And if you're a migrant heading to Australia, you used to have to wait 2 years before you're entitled to any welfare benefits. That's now a 4-year wait. So you better go with a big stash of cash because you've got to look after yourself now. So don't be thinking you can. For property investors, every year I put this up and there's something. This year, nothing to report. No changes, no nothing, all the same. But just remind you, last year was everything to report. So last year was, where are we? Last year we had, stay. 12.5%, now if you sell your property living overseas and it's worth over $750,000, you have to have a 12.5% withholding tax. A reminder, that's not an additional tax. It's in advance of you calculating and paying your capital gains tax. You would get it back if it was less. You can vary it if necessary. You can't claim your travel costs anymore. That's why you need to come on this cheap travel with Qantas sponsored. Thank you very much. We'll find a solution for every problem. And of course you've got vacancy tax. If you leave your property vacant more than half a year, there is a tax to be paid, and there's the exemption of the expats with your previous home. That's still in play, which is shocking. We've got, just a quick update on that. The legislation passed through the lower house. It's gone off to the Senate committee and is pending a vote. It is absolutely inevitable. Labor and Liberal have said they both are happy to pass it. One of the issues, just reading the Treasury response to me is, I've been begging them to say, look, exclude Australian expatriates, exclude citizens, exclude permanent residents. Apparently we can't do that because of tax treaties, so it has to be all or nothing, and they're quite happy to just do all. Now, it's going to be going, no matter what we've done, we've stopped it, but no one really cares about foreigners anymore in Australia. No one cares about expatriates. We're all on our own. That's just the way it is. But we can still stir up a bit of a hornet's nest to maybe get them to stop the legislation in full. So make sure you do try and do that. We've got a media release which I'll send you for coming. Just stir it around. We had 1,400 people sign up petition just to be ignored. But at least I wasn't the only one being ignored. We're all ignored together. If you want to, I don't know how these viral things happen. I've never used it, but I thought you just put a hashtag in front of something and see how it goes. So I've started. Hashtag Australians are not foreigners. Again, it won't work, but let's give it a go. And the important thing is don't panic sell. And what happens is this change is coming in that basically means if you've lived in a home in Australia previously, under the old law, if you sold it, you wouldn't have to pay capital gains tax for the period of time you lived in it and up to 6 years thereafter. The new law says if you sell it while living overseas, it disregard any period of occupation in that house, and you have to pay capital gains tax in full. It's an absolute outrage. But what it means is that the loophole, if you want to call it a loophole, or what the government's calling a fairness provision, is that if you sell it when you're back in Australia, it's as if nothing ever changed. So you just need to not sell your home till you go back to Australia. Now, you could sell it if you want up until the bring-in time of June 19. So if you sold your property that you previously lived in Australia up until June 19, you still get all the principal residence benefits. But I'm not sure I'd want to sell. It'd be tempting certainly in Sydney where the market is at a peak, but you want to make sure you don't do it for the wrong reason. And tax is always the wrong reason to do something. It should be because it's economically sound, because it's market sensible. That should be the primary driver of any decision. But just make sure you don't sell it till you go back overseas. Now, if you're not sure, come and see us before June 19, because we could sell it to a trust, we could sell it to a company. There's some choices we've got there. The foreign vacancy tax, that's another interesting one. It's $5,500 a year if you leave your property vacant. Now, it only applies to purchases after 9th of May, but it's got to be genuinely occupied. You can't say you're just using it a little bit here and a little bit there. It has to be genuinely occupied for more than 183 days. And you can rent it. If it's available for rent, that qualifies as occupied, but only if you're seeking a long-term tenant, and long-term being more than 30 days. So just because you might have your property on Airbnb looking for a 4-night, 7-night, 14-night tenant, that will not qualify for its vacancy period while you're looking for a tenant as occupied. But if you are looking for a permanent tenant, a 6-month, a 12-month lease, that would qualify. So again, if you're looking for that, come and talk to us. Steve James is over there in the corner. Now, we can obviously rent your property out for you now in Perth, Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane, so we can make sure you don't have to worry about the vacancy tax. It doesn't apply to Australian citizens or PRs, that's one good thing, but it's something that you have to be done. Now, one of the worst things about this new tax regime is how they've structured it. Now, you would think that only people who had left their property vacant would have to tell the tax office, oh, my property's vacant, here's my money. But of course, in their infinite wisdom, what they've done is says everybody has to go and tell them that the property is not vacant. So if you are renting your property out, you now have to every year go and tell them that it's not empty. So given that probably 97 to 98% of all people don't leave their property vacant, those 98% of people have to do work rather than the 2% do the work. Just the way the government works. Now, it's only if you bought after 9th of May 17, only if you are not Australian citizen or PR, and only if you've got a property in Australia. If it's vacant, you have to pay. If it's not vacant, you have to tell them that it's not vacant. And it's done on the anniversary of your settlement. So it's not the year end or anything like that, it's on the anniversary of your settlement. Victoria has its own vacancy tax as well. So it's not bad enough you've got $5,500 for Australia federally, and that's if the property is worth under $1 million. If it's more than $1 million, it increases $5,500 per million. So it gets pretty expensive to leave your property vacant, but Victoria will tax you as well, again, as a foreigner, not a permanent resident, not a citizen. And then land tax is something that you all need to be aware of. Now, it's not part of this budget. It's not a federal issue. It's a state issue. It's not done as part of your income tax requirements. It's part of your ownership requirements. And a lot of people don't realise it. It's got to be done by you voluntarily. You have to notify the land tax office in the state you own the property, because it is a state-based tax, and you need to tell them, I own that property, do I need to pay tax? And what's happened in the last few years, the valuations have risen quite significantly, and more people now have to pay tax. And it's getting uglier and uglier. It's getting certainly high. One of the ways around it is to spread the load, because most states have an exemption threshold, but they've lifted them up marginally and they've snuck the valuations up significantly. Sometimes the valuations have gone up even if the market hasn't gone up. It's quite cunning, really. But this is what it all is, and then they've brought in foreign surcharges as well in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. So you've got to be mindful, if you are not an Australian citizen or a PR in Victoria, or Queensland, you've got some surcharge. In New South Wales, they charge a surcharge even for permanent residents. Only a citizen is exempt from the foreign duty. So you've got to be mindful of that. If you need help, we'll obviously help you with that, but you need to be mindful, because the state tax authorities are not very nice. They will not give very much reduction in penalties. They are not very forgiving, and they'll hit you with back taxes, and it'll really scare you, because it's quite frightening. And you must do it yourself. Don't expect your property agent, your accountant or anyone to do it. You must check yourself. Hopefully you're getting it, but if not, go check. In terms of the exchange, the Aussie dollar against the US, well, it's got back towards, or just under 75 cents now. Again, if you've been to our previous seminars, we're still holding the personal opinion that the dollar should be in that 75 to 80 cents range, and we've been pretty well right most of the time except now. So for the first time it's dropped under 75. We don't think that that's perhaps a long-term trend, but we'll soon see. But, it's interesting. But for Singapore dollar's just gone under parity, hasn't it? Wow, what's happening there? That's a pretty good time to be buying something in Australia, either a property or a nice little syndicate through Greg or some shares or something. There's great value in Australia, great revenue potential, and the dollar is crazy good. Crazy good. So if you were thinking about it, why not? In terms of interest rates have not changed in Australia officially since August 2016. That's a long time on the interest rate calendar. You can see it's flatlined all this time here, unchanged. But surprisingly, even though the official rate has not changed, the actual rate has. It's been going up because the banks have been given a license to charge more for investors, sneak in a little bit extra if you're interest only instead of principal and interest. So the banks are making more and more revenue. I think Westpac just announced a 7% increase in profit, which is awesome because I have some of their shares. But you've got to be very mindful of interest rates because I don't think we're going to see the RBA move on interest rates for quite a while. There's no real necessity to do so. Inflation is in check. The economy is not rapidly growing. It's just steady. So I think we're in a low interest rate environment officially, but the banks are sneaky. Many clients are now being hit, if they're foreigners, non-Australians, they're being hit with a surcharge of 1 to 1.5%. Absolutely outrageous. But there's no lending alternative for foreigners at the moment until we get our fund launched in the next couple of weeks. But it's absolutely not good. Here are the current indicative rates, just for your reference. If you're an owner-occupier, which is hard to do from Singapore, the rates are best. But when you're going down to live, when you return, when you migrate, it's going to be cheaper. But, you can see as an investor, there is a premium now of 0.2, and 0.6 if it's interest only. Now, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. The fixed rates still remain very, very good value. So I still would encourage you to consider fixed rates. It's certainly something to look at, particularly if you're not intending to sell. Stability is everything. But we've got a cheap rate on the face of it, but be careful as an investor, be careful as a foreign investor. In terms of the economy, you can see it's not growing at a great pace. But it's growing enough. As long as it's growing at that 2-3%, the revenue impact for the government is huge. It's the employment that they need. And inflation is amazingly in check still. I still don't believe that number. I cannot believe that we run at 2% inflation in Australia because I go back regularly and everything gets more expensive. But it's officially there, which allows the RBA to keep those interest rates in check. Now you can see the driver of that economic growth is not the US under Donald Trump. It's not China going crazy, because it's not. It's the fact that we've got 400,000 more people in Australia. The economic benefit of nappies is phenomenal. And there is 200,000 babies in that. 200,000. And the thing is, these days, nobody washes a nappy anymore. It's a lost art. We go and buy a new one. We should all be in the nappy business or the nappy disposal business, I reckon. But that population growth, 200,000 natural births, 200,000 migration, is Australia's secret weapon, and why we've now gone 27 years without a recession. Because that's expanding our economy. And what it does do is it does cover up a sluggish, inefficient economy. I think the retail figures once again came out, I think, this week, and they basically were flat. Flat. No growth in retail figures this year, which is surprising because we've got 1.6% more customers. So you would think that you'd have had 1.6% increase in retail if you got 1.6% more customers. But that just shows how inefficient our general economy is. But thank goodness we've got so many people coming, because if we didn't, retail sales would have probably gone backwards 1%. So those nappies, they're holding up the entire country. Now you can see in Sydney, and it's at record growth, 1.6. It hasn't been that good since 2009. 123,000 people in Sydney. In Melbourne, 147,000 more people than a year before. 2.4%, not only the highest quantum, but the highest rate of growth as well. And that's why that economy is in very, very good shape. That's why the property market is in very, very good shape. Now, New South Wales has been having a tear away, and it's not going to fall away because of that population growth. But it's run out of physical energy, so it can't keep growing at the current pace. But you can see Queensland, interestingly, is now finally getting back towards its heyday of 1.7 to 2%. It's been really sluggish for quite a while. Perth was at world record pace and now is near on the slowest in Australia. And these things are important. You can't get economic growth, you can't get property growth without population growth. But population without jobs is still not good. And this is the great secret with Australia right now. We've got more people getting more jobs because they all need to look after each other. And that means, more importantly, more taxpayers. 400,000 more taxpayers, $3 to $4 billion a year extra revenue unexpected without the cost. And that is the Turnbull government's secret weapon. No one believed it. Everyone thought it was rhetoric. That's the fact. That's not luck. That was planning. They've been saying that for 3 years, and you can see they've delivered it in spades. And mainly full-time, a little bit of part-time. Last year a bit sluggish, but a real boost, and hence that $10 billion turnaround. Massive money. In terms of the property cycle, well, I'm finally prepared to put Sydney officially into the downturn phase. I've been holding back for the last 2 years. I've told you that it was, but the population growth was so powerful that it kept growing. Probably a bit more than it should have. Now, it's given back some of its profit at the moment, but it is now officially in that slow phase. I had to laugh. I mean, we've been warning people that the growth would stop, and everyone's been going, no, you can't lose in Sydney. The other day, I read an article, I think in the Financial Review, that said there will be no property growth in Sydney for 30 years. 30 years. By the same journalist who was predicting 6 months earlier that you couldn't lose and you'll double your dough by Christmas. And that's how crazy it is. The wind changes fast. But it's a natural cycle. You can't grow really fast forever. It's not physically possible. It has to slow down. It's just the way it is. But you can see best opportunity is still Brisbane and Perth. Melbourne is starting to get in that high growth, end of growth phase. But its population growth is so powerful that it's going to have legs just like Sydney did. You've got here, this is the ABS stats, House Price Index, over the last few years. And you can see there's Sydney, on the second line here, and the last 2 quarters in Sydney have been negative growth. Again, it's been pulling along very nicely. You can see this is quarterly growth, 2.8, 2.6, 5.2, phenomenal growth. And you can see it had 1, 2, 3, 4 years of successive double-digit growth. Very, very rarely does any market anywhere in the world generate 4 successive years of double-digit growth. It has to run out of steam, and that's exactly what Sydney did. It just ran out of steam. You've got buyer fatigue, you can't afford anymore. You've still got budget limitation in Australia because although finance is available and currently cheap, the banks don't hand it out unless you've got substantial deposit and, more importantly, can absolutely prove you can afford the loan. If you cannot afford the repayment, you don't get the loan. And the loan is not calculated on what the current interest rate is of 4%, 5%. It's based on a what if it goes up 2 or 3% level. So they do the calculation at 6.5 or 7%, even though they're only charging you 4.5. And that's a safety mechanism. So what's happening now with the prices in Sydney being so high, it's very hard for people to get those loans. So they can't afford to pay the price that people want. You've got to come and meet the market. But that's a natural thing in a cycle. Now you can see in Melbourne, it's gone 9.6, almost double digit, 10.8, 10.2. So it's probably got maybe 1 or 2 years left. But again, it's population fueled, not speculation, not foreign investment. It's population fueled like Sydney was, but it will eventually run out of legs. But you can see Perth's been languishing there badly, but it did 1.1 in the quarter. It's still year on year negative, but it's the next opportunity market as it's going through its natural cycle. But instead of it being a boom cycle that's cooling off, it's a misery cycle that's getting happier. And that's what happens. Misery, happiness, ridiculousness goes in that volume. And you can see everything's going exactly as we expected, and it's just moving along nicely. So these cycles are traditional. So don't get worried when you hear that, oh my goodness, Sydney's going off. Of course it's going off. It had to. It was physically impossible to keep going. To give you an idea of the overall, this is the REA, Real Estate Institute of Australia stats, slightly different. But here we go. Look, in the last quarter, according to REA, oh look, Brisbane and Perth were the top major cities. That's what we thought would happen. That's what has happened. It's their turn in the sun. And there's Sydney cooling off. Melbourne's still strong at 1.1 a quarter, but starting to just slow down a little bit from the double digit. Not a bad thing. A good thing. A pause, a rest is necessary. But with that population growth in Sydney and Melbourne so strong, there's no real undercurrent of collapse or worry. It's still a naturally driven market by natural population growth. So they're doing quite well. And there's nothing in these budgets to change that. In fact, it's essential for this budget that those markets stay strong, because one of the biggest driver of economic growth in Australia right now is the construction industry. It picked up all the slack from the mining, and it still has a lot more to grow, because Melbourne, there's 147,000 people that don't have a house yet. In Sydney, there's 120,000 people that are looking for somewhere to live. And we don't have a massive oversupply, so they need to build some houses for those, and when they build them, that's more jobs, that's more activity, everything works. Interestingly though, is if you look at the difference to the Australian average, Sydney is significantly higher, 30-40% above the Australian average. So it makes it nervous. You're going to naturally see people move from the bigger, congested, expensive city to the cheaper, more lifestyle-driven option. That's natural. Doesn't mean Sydney's no good, doesn't mean anywhere else is better. It's just eventually how long do you put up with it. So everything's going according to plan. We still believe Perth and Brisbane offer the best value at the moment. But there's nothing wrong with Sydney. There's nothing wrong with Melbourne. You just have to be very careful when you buy in a high growth cycle that you buy a high quality asset that will support, continue to grow from demand, not from luck. One of the reasons I don't think that there's risk in Sydney, the vacancy rate is still crazy good at 2.1. Now, it has come up from 1.9. And that's because during a construction boom, guess what? They're constructing. So there is more houses available, but just a little bit more than the people coming in. And in Melbourne, they're not building enough apparently. It's still contracting the vacancy rate. But importantly, there's Brisbane and Perth. They're contracting finally. They've been increasing their vacancy for a while. And this is the first time that Perth's had a significant decline in its vacancy, which again is sign of the times. It's saying it's turning around, it's a good opportunity, but it won't be a great opportunity forever. But still with a 5.5 vacancy, there's still some room to get that going. You'll be glad to know we're almost finishing. So what are the highlights? Well, I reckon the fact that you've beaten your estimates, the first time in a decade that any government, Liberal or Labor, has done so, hats off. And to do it twice, top job, mate, top job. To be controlling your spending when you know all that money's coming in, God, that must have been tempting. I don't know if I could have done that. I don't know about you, but if I had an extra $10 billion just arrive in my bank account, I'm not sure I ring my bank manager and say, are you sure this is mine? I think I'm drawing it out of the ATM. But they said, no, let's leave it there. We might need it. And this budget didn't really do much for a lot of people, but it did something for everyone. Because everyone's going to get that little bit of tax cut. You know, vast majority, 70% of people, something like 10 million people are going to get some tax relief. Maybe not huge, but something. And when you're moving that tax rate to a pretty much top of most people, 32.5%, you've got to be happy about that. You've got to be happy about that. And I think the fact that we have got a real and working plan at government level for the first time in a long time, rather than this policy on the run and checkbook diplomacy, that's a good thing for me. I like to have that certainty. I like to know we've got things coming on. The low lights, I can't stand the way they keep ignoring us. Don't even return our calls. I send emails, never come back. That's just the way it is. Hopefully one day they'll recognise that we're an important part of it. It's the foreigners that are helping drive that construction industry. It's the expats that are helping export and global business growth. But they have a lot of rhetoric about how good we are. They love us, they want our money, they want to take the land tax, but not much respect. The only thing I'm not liking about the tax cuts is I'm not sure we'll be able to see them. You can see here, our mates there, it's not just one election, it's a heap of elections. It's 2018, perhaps, maybe 2019, then 2022, 23, and then we see the real tax cuts. So they've got to get voted in twice. Now they're trying to pass those tax cuts now as law. That's going to be interesting to see if they can get it through. And Labor are going to have to make a stand. Are they prepared to be fair, or do they want to be caught out as grabbers? It's going to be very interesting. And I'm disappointed as an Australian that, it doesn't matter what good job they do, the minority still gets up and gets angry. I saw people being really angry that they didn't get more money or they had some taken off them. The country has been financially in shambles. We've got near on $500 billion worth of debt. You can't keep getting. And the lack of credit they're giving these guys for what they're achieving, it's disappointing. Especially when you consider how easy it is for us to dump on them when we reckon they're wrong. They've got one moment that they actually got it right. Is it that hard to say, well done, chaps, well done, chaps? But no, not in Australia anymore. It's you should have done this, you could have done better, you shouldn't have given that tax cut, you should have given it to me. It's changing in Australia, I hope it changes back. I'm giving them 23.9 out of 25. Why? Because 23.9 is the new speed limit for tax. So I'm going to give them that. I think it's a good budget. It wasn't too generous, it wasn't too this, it was forward thinking, it was strategic, it was sensible. So you've got to be happy about that. And it's working the numbers for the first time towards reality. So 23.9 I'm giving it. On that note, I'm very glad to let you know that we've finished. And I'll happily open it up for questions and then let you all on your merry way. Thank you very much for attending.